In the picturesque coastal town of Pelican Bay, where the rugged cliffs of the Pacific Northwest meet the churning ocean, a dark tale of jealousy, betrayal, and murder was about to unfold. The community, known for its close-knit atmosphere and thriving fishing industry, would soon be shaken to its core by a series of brutal killings that would leave no one untouched. At the center of this tragic story was the Callahan family. Gregory Callahan, a successful real estate developer, and his wife, Evelyn, a beloved high school English teacher, were pillars of the community. Their sprawling Victorian home, perched atop the highest cliff in town, was a landmark that seemed to embody the couple's status and success. From the outside, the Callahans appeared to have it all. Gregory, with his salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes, cut an imposing figure in his tailored suits. His charm and business acumen had transformed Pelican Bay from a sleepy fishing village into a burgeoning tourist destination. Evelyn, with her warm smile and gentle demeanor, was adored by her students and colleagues alike. Her book club was the talk of the town, and her garden parties were social events that no one dared to miss. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect marriage, a storm was brewing. Gregory, despite his outward success, was a man consumed by insecurity and possessiveness. His charming facade masked a deep-seated paranoia that gnawed at him day and night. He saw threats to his marriage everywhere, interpreting every glance, every casual touch, as a sign of his wife's potential infidelity. Evelyn, for her part, was oblivious to the darkness growing within her husband. She went about her days with the same warmth and openness she had always possessed, unaware that her friendly nature was feeding Gregory's unfounded suspicions. The first cracks in their relationship began to show at the annual Pelican Bay Seafood Festival. As Gregory watched Evelyn laugh and chat with various townspeople, his jealousy began to simmer. He noticed how she touched the arm of Jack Morrison, the ruggedly handsome local fisherman, as they shared a joke. He saw the way she leaned in close to hear David Chin, the soft-spoken librarian, over the noise of the crowd. To Gregory, these innocent interactions were proof of his worst fears. In his mind, Evelyn was not just being friendly, she was flirting, perhaps even planning assignations with these men right under his nose. As the festival wound down and the couple made their way home, Gregory's mood darkened. The winding cliffside road seemed to mirror his twisting thoughts. Evelyn, sensing his tension, attempted to lighten the mood. "Wasn't it a lovely evening, dear? I think this year's festival was the best yet. Did you try the crab cakes at Martha's booth? Simply divine." Gregory's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "I saw you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Evelyn turned to him, confusion evident on her face. "Saw me what, Gregory?" "With Jack and David. And who knows how many others?" Laughing, touching, whispering. "Do you think I'm blind, Evelyn? Do you think I'm a fool?" Evelyn's confusion turned to shock, then indignation. "Gregory, what on earth are you talking about? They're our friends. I was being polite, nothing more. You can't possibly think." "I know what I saw." Gregory's shout filled the car, causing Evelyn to flinch. "Don't lie to me. I won't be made a fool of, not by you, not by anyone." The rest of the drive passed in tense silence, Evelyn's mind reeling as she tried to understand her husband's sudden outburst. As they arrived home, she hoped that a good night's sleep would calm Gregory's inexplicable anger. But the next morning brought no relief. Gregory was cold and distant, his eyes following Evelyn's every move with suspicion. As she prepared to leave for work, he blocked her path. "I think it's best if you stay home today," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "In fact, I think you should take some time off. You've been working too hard, spending too much time away from home. It's not good for you, or for us." Evelyn stared at him in disbelief. "Gregory, I can't just not go to work. I have classes to teach, meetings to attend. What's gotten into you?" Gregory's face hardened. "I said, you're staying home. Call in sick. Take a leave of absence. I don't care. But you're not leaving this house." With that, he turned and left for work, leaving Evelyn standing in shock in their foyer. As the sound of his car faded away, she sank to the floor, her mind whirling. What had happened to the man she married? How had things changed so drastically overnight? Little did Evelyn know, this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would engulf not just her, but the entire town of Pelican Bay. Over the next few weeks, Gregory's behavior became increasingly erratic and controlling. He installed new locks on the doors and windows, claiming it was for their safety. He disconnected the home phone and confiscated Evelyn's cell phone, insisting that they needed to focus on their relationship, but without outside distractions. He even went so far as to board up several of the windows, saying the sea air was damaging the wood frames. Evelyn, isolated and increasingly fearful, tried repeatedly to reason with her husband. She suggested counseling, pleaded for him to let her return to work, begged him to explain what had brought on this sudden change. But Gregory remained unmoved, his paranoia growing with each passing day. As Evelyn's absence from school stretched on, concern began to ripple through Pelican Bay. Her colleagues, worried by the vague excuses Gregory gave for her extended leave, started to ask questions. Students missed their favorite teacher, and rumors began to circulate. It was David Chen, the librarian, who first decided to check on Evelyn in person. One crisp autumn afternoon, he made his way up the winding road to the Callahan house, a basket of books in hand, a pretext for his visit. As David approached the front door, he couldn't shake a feeling of unease. The house, once warm and inviting, now seemed to loom ominously against the gray sky. The usually immaculate garden was overgrown, and several windows were obscured by wooden boards. David rang the doorbell, hearing it echo through the house. After a long moment, the door opened a crack, and Gregory's face appeared in the gap. "Yes? What do you want?" Gregory's voice was gruff, his eyes darting suspiciously over David's shoulder as if expecting to see others. David put on his most genial smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Callahan. I brought some books for Evelyn. We've all been missing her at the library, and I thought these might cheer her up while she's recovering." Gregory's eyes narrowed. "Evelyn doesn't need any books. She's fine. We're fine. Thank you for your concern, but please leave." As Gregory moved to close the door, David caught a glimpse of movement behind him. For a brief moment, he saw Evelyn's pale face peering around a corner, her eyes wide with what looked like fear. Before David could react, the door slammed shut. Shaken, David retreated to his car. As he drove back into town, his mind raced. Something was clearly wrong at the Callahan house, but what could he do? He had no proof of anything untoward, just a bad feeling and a glimpse of a frightened face. Unbeknownst to David, his visit had dire consequences for Evelyn. Gregory, enraged by what he saw as yet another man trying to come between them, unleashed his anger on his wife. "You called him here, didn't you?" he roared, advancing on Evelyn as she cowered in the corner of their bedroom. "You've been sending messages somehow, haven't you? Trying to turn people against me, make me look crazy." "No, Gregory, I swear," Evelyn pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "I haven't contacted anyone. Please, you have to believe me." But Gregory was beyond reason. In his twisted mind, Evelyn's denials were further proof of her deceit. As his hand closed around her throat, Evelyn's world went black. When Evelyn regained consciousness, she found herself locked in the basement. The once cozy space, filled with comfortable furniture and bookshelves, had been transformed into a makeshift prison. The windows were boarded up, the phone line disconnected. A thin mattress on the floor, a bucket in the corner, and a few bottles of water were the only amenities. As the reality of her situation sank in, Evelyn's mind reeled. How had it come to this? The man she had loved, the life they had built together, it had all crumbled so quickly. As she huddled on the mattress, shivering in the damp basement air, Evelyn realized with growing horror that she might not survive her husband's paranoid delusions. Meanwhile, David Chen's concerns were growing. Unable to shake the memory of Evelyn's frightened face, he decided to confide in Jack Morrison, the fisherman who had also been a close friend of the Callahans. Over coffee at the local diner, David shared his experience at the Callahan house. Jack listened intently, his weathered face growing increasingly troubled. "I've known Gregory for years," Jack said, his voice low. "He's always been a bit intense, but this doesn't sound like him at all. And Evelyn, she'd never just disappear like this without a word to anyone." The two men agreed that something needed to be done, but they were hesitant to involve the authorities without more concrete evidence. They decided to keep a close eye on the Callahan house and try to gather more information. What David and Jack didn't know was that their conversation had been overheard. Seated in a booth behind them, partially hidden by a large potted plant, was Gregory Callahan himself. He had taken to following David after the librarian's visit to his home, convinced that the man was having an affair with Evelyn. As Gregory listened to the two men discuss his wife and speculate about his mental state, his rage reached a boiling point. In his paranoid mind, this was confirmation of a vast conspiracy against him. Not only was Evelyn unfaithful, but she had turned the whole town against him. Slipping out of the diner unnoticed, Gregory made his way home, his mind churning with dark thoughts. As he entered the basement where Evelyn was being held, she looked up at him with a mix of fear and hope. "Gregory, please," she began, her voice hoarse from lack of use. "This isn't you. The man I married would never do this. Please, let's just talk." "Shut up," Gregory roared, his face contorted with fury. "I heard them, Evelyn. Your lovers plotting against me. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think you could make a fool of me?" Evelyn's confusion was genuine. "What are you talking about?" "Gregory, I haven't spoken to anyone. I've been locked down here for days." But her protests fell on deaf ears. In Gregory's delusional state, every denial was further proof of her guilt. As he advanced on her, eyes blazing with murderous intent, Evelyn realized with horror that reasoning with him was futile. The struggle was brief but violent. Evelyn, weakened by days of confinement and poor nutrition, was no match for Gregory's rage-fueled strength. As his hands closed around her throat for the second time, Evelyn's last thoughts were of the life she had loved, the students she would never see again, and the future that had been stolen from her. When it was over, Gregory stood over his wife's lifeless body, his mind strangely calm. In his twisted logic, he had eliminated the source of his problems. But deep down, a part of him knew that this was just the beginning. As the reality of what he had done began to sink in, Gregory's paranoid mind started to race. He couldn't let anyone find out. He had to protect himself, had to eliminate anyone who might suspect him. And he knew just where to start. The next day, David Chen was working late at the library, cataloging a new shipment of books. The building was quiet, most of the staff and patrons having left hours ago. As he reached for another book, a sound from the stacks made him pause. "Hello," he called out, peering into the dimly lit aisles. "Is someone there?" "The library's closed, I'm afraid." There was no response, but David could have sworn he heard footsteps. Unnerved, he decided it was time to call it a night. As he gathered his things and headed for the exit, he never saw the figure lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The attack was swift and brutal. Gregory, fueled by his delusional rage, overpowered David before the librarian could even cry out for help. Using a heavy bronze bookend, he struck David repeatedly, each blow feeding his paranoid conviction that he was eliminating a threat to his marriage and his freedom. When it was over, Gregory stood over David's body, panting heavily. The library, once a place of quiet contemplation, was now a gruesome crime scene. But in Gregory's fractured mind, this was just another necessary step in protecting himself and his secrets. With cold efficiency, Gregory set about staging the scene. He scattered books around the body, overturned furniture, and rifled through the cash register, making it look like a robbery gone wrong. Then, careful not to leave any traces of his presence, he slipped out into the night. The discovery of David Chen's body the next morning sent shockwaves through Pelican Bay. The peaceful town, unaccustomed to such violence, was plunged into a state of fear and confusion. As news spread, people locked their doors and eyed their neighbors with suspicion. Detective Sarah Lindstrom of the Pelican Bay Police Department was assigned to lead the investigation. A seasoned officer with a sharp mind and a no-nonsense attitude, Lindstrom had seen her fair share of crimes in larger cities before settling in this coastal town. But even she was taken aback by the brutality of the murder. As Lindstrom and her team combed through the crime scene, several things struck her as odd. While the scene suggested a robbery, nothing of value seemed to be missing. The violence of the attack also seemed personal, not the kind of thing you'd typically see in a random robbery. "Something doesn't add up here," Lindstrom muttered to her partner, Detective Mike Ramirez. "This feels staged. We need to dig deeper into Chen's life, see if he had any enemies, or if he was involved in anything that might have led to this." As the investigation progressed, Lindstrom's suspicions grew. Interviews with David's colleagues and friends painted a picture of a kind, gentle man with no known enemies. His financial records were clean, showing no signs of debt or suspicious transactions that might have motivated a robbery. One name that kept coming up in the interviews was Evelyn Callahan. Several people mentioned that David had been concerned about her extended absence from work and had even visited her home to check on her. Intrigued by this connection, Lindstrom decided it was time to pay a visit to the Callahan residence. As she and Ramirez drove up the winding road to the Cliff Top House, she couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Gregory Callahan answered the door, his imposing figure filling the doorframe. "Yes? Can I help you?" His tone was polite, but there was an undercurrent of tension in his voice. Lindstrom introduced herself and Ramirez, explaining that they were investigating David Chen's murder and wanted to ask a few questions. Gregory's face remained impassive as he invited them in, leading them to a spacious living room with a breathtaking view of the ocean. "Terrible business," that Gregory said as they sat down. "David was a good man. I can't imagine who would want to harm him." Lindstrom watched Gregory carefully as she asked her questions. Where was he on the night of the murder? Did he know if David had any enemies? Had he noticed anything unusual in David's behavior recently? Gregory's answers were smooth and consistent. He had been home all night, working late in his home office. No, he couldn't think of anyone who would want to harm David. The librarian had seemed his usual self the last time they had spoken. As the interview progressed, Lindstrom broached the subject of Evelyn. "We've heard that your wife has been absent from work for some time. Is she all right? We'd like to speak with her as well if possible." A flicker of something, anger? Fear? Passed across Gregory's face before he composed himself. "Evelyn is visiting her sister in Oregon," he said smoothly. "She's been having some health issues and needed a change of scenery. I'm not sure when she'll be back." Lindstrom made a mental note of Gregory's reaction. Something about his explanation didn't sit right with her. As they were preparing to leave, she asked to use the bathroom, using the opportunity to glance into other rooms as she passed. The house seemed oddly still, with several doors closed and some windows boarded up. Back at the station, Lindstrom shared her impressions with Ramirez. "There's something off about Gregory Callahan," she said, poring over her notes. "His story checks out on the surface, but my gut tells me he's hiding something. And what's the deal with his wife being gone for so long without anyone hearing from her?" Ramirez nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. "I'll run a background check on both Callahans, see if anything pops up. Maybe we should also try to contact this sister in Oregon, verify Evelyn's whereabouts." As the detectives dug deeper, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Gregory's background check came back clean, but Evelyn's was more concerning. There were no recent credit card transactions, no phone calls, no social media activity, nothing to indicate she was actually in Oregon or anywhere else. It was as if she had simply vanished. The call to Evelyn's sister in Oregon proved even more alarming. Karen Matthews, Evelyn's younger sister, was shocked to hear from the police. "Evelyn isn't here," she said, her voice tight with worry. "I haven't spoken to her in weeks. The last time we talked, she seemed off, scared almost. But she wouldn't tell me why. What's going on? Is my sister okay?" This new information sent the investigation into high gear. Lindstrom obtained a warrant to search the Callahan residence thoroughly. As they approached the house for the second time, Gregory Callahan's calm facade began to crack. "You have no right to be here," he shouted as the detectives and forensic team entered his home. "This is harassment. I'll have your badges for this." But his protests fell on deaf ears as the team methodically went through the house. It was in the basement that they made the grim discovery traces of blood that had seeped into the concrete floor, despite attempts to clean it. Forensic analysis would later confirm it was Evelyn's. As the evidence mounted, Gregory's composure crumbled entirely. In a fit of rage, he attempted to flee, nearly making it to his car before Ramirez tackled him to the ground. As he was handcuffed and read his rights, Gregory began to rant, his delusions pouring out in a torrent of accusations and justifications. "She made me do it," he screamed as he was led away. "Evelyn and her lovers, they were all against me. I had to protect myself. Don't you see?" The arrest of Gregory Callahan sent shockwaves through Pelican Bay. As news spread of Evelyn's presumed murder and David Chen's connection to the case, the town grappled with the horrifying reality that had been unfolding in their midst. But the story wasn't over. As Lindstrom and Ramirez continued to unravel Gregory's movements over the past weeks, they made another chilling discovery. Jack Morrison, the fisherman who had been asking questions about Evelyn's disappearance, had gone missing 3 days after David Chen's murder. A search of the area around the Callahan house led investigators to a remote cove, accessible only by a treacherous path down the cliffs. There, partially submerged in a tidal pool, they found Jack's body. He had been bludgeoned in a manner similar to David Chen, his body weighted down with rocks in an attempt to hide it. As the full extent of Gregory's crimes came to light, the peaceful town of Pelican Bay was forced to confront the darkness that had been hiding behind closed doors. 3 murders, each more brutal than the last committed by a man many had considered a pillar of the community. The trial of Gregory Callahan became a media sensation, drawing attention from across the country. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Marcus Hendricks, painted a damning picture of a man driven to murder by his own paranoid delusions. Forensic evidence tied Gregory to all 3 murder scenes. The murder weapon used on David Chen was found hidden in the Callahan's garage, still bearing traces of the librarian's blood. Fibers from Jack Morrison's clothing were found in Gregory's car. And, most damning of all, Evelyn's blood was found not just in the basement, but also on clothing hidden in a secret compartment in Gregory's closet. Gregory's defense team attempted to argue that he had been in the grip of a psychotic break, not responsible for his actions due to mental illness. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about the devastating effects of untreated paranoid personality disorder. But the prosecution countered with evidence of Gregory's careful attempts to cover up his crimes. The staged robbery at the library, the disposal of Jack's body, the elaborate lies about Evelyn's whereabouts all pointed to a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Throughout the trial, Gregory sat impassively, showing little reaction to the gruesome evidence presented or the heart-wrenching testimony of Evelyn's sister and the victim's friends. It was only when the prosecution played a video of Evelyn teaching her class, her face alight with passion for her subject, that a flicker of emotion crossed Gregory's face, a mixture of longing and rage that sent chills through the courtroom. After weeks of testimony, mountains of evidence, and impassioned arguments from both sides, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for just 6 hours before reaching a verdict. As the courtroom fell silent, the jury foreman stood. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Evelyn Callahan, we find the defendant, Gregory Callahan, guilty. A collective gasp went through the room, but the foreman wasn't finished. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of David Chen, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Jack Morrison, we find the defendant guilty. Gregory Callahan showed no reaction as the verdicts were read, his face a mask of stone. But those watching closely might have seen a slight tremor in his hands, the only outward sign of the turmoil within. The sentencing hearing, held 2 weeks later, was a somber affair. Victim impact statements were read, with Evelyn's sister, David's elderly mother, and Jack's wife all speaking of the devastation Gregory's actions had wrought on their lives. When given the opportunity to speak, Gregory finally broke his silence. In a rambling, disjointed statement, he expressed remorse not for his actions, but for the fact that he had been misunderstood and persecuted by a world that couldn't comprehend his pain. Judge Amelia Thornton listened to all sides before delivering her sentence. Her words were measured but filled with barely contained anger as she addressed Gregory directly. "Mr. Callahan, the crimes you have committed are among the most heinous this court has ever seen. You murdered your wife, a woman who by all accounts was beloved by her community and dedicated to her students. You then killed 2 innocent men whose only crime was caring enough about your wife to ask questions about her disappearance. Your actions have torn apart not just 3 families, but an entire community." The courtroom held its breath as Judge Thornton continued. "While the court acknowledges the mental health issues raised by the defense, they do not excuse your actions. The calculated nature of your attempts to cover up these murders shows that you were fully aware of the wrongness of your deeds. It is the judgment of this court that you pose a continued danger to society." Judge Thornton paused, her gaze boring into Gregory. "For each count of first-degree murder, this court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. These sentences are to be served consecutively. Mr. Callahan, you will spend the rest of your natural life behind bars, with no hope of ever walking free again." As the sentence was read, a mix of emotions swept through the courtroom. There were sighs of relief, muffled sobs, and a palpable sense that while justice had been served, the wounds inflicted on the families of Evelyn, David, and Jack, and on the community of Pelican Bay, would take years to heal. Gregory Callahan was led away in shackles, his face still impassive. As the doors of the courtroom closed behind him, the story of the jealous husband who killed his wife and her perceived lovers came to an end, but the impact of his actions would continue to ripple through the lives of all who had been touched by this tragedy for years to come. In the aftermath of the trial, Pelican Bay struggled to come to terms with what had happened in their midst. The Callahan house, once the crown jewel of the town, stood empty, a silent reminder of the horrors that had unfolded behind its walls. There was talk of tearing it down, of turning the land into a memorial park, but for now it remained a scar on the landscape that mirrored the emotional scars carried by the town's residents. The community came together to honor the memories of Evelyn, David, and Jack. A scholarship fund was established in Evelyn's name, dedicated to supporting students who wanted to pursue teaching careers. The library dedicated a new wing to David, filling it with the kinds of books he had loved and shared with patrons over the years. And a small monument was erected at the harbor, paying tribute to Jack and reminding all who saw it of his kindness and bravery. As Gregory Callahan began his life sentences, the gates of the maximum security prison closing behind him with a final, resonant clang, the town of Pelican Bay began its long journey towards healing. The road ahead would be difficult, but as the community came together, supporting each other and honoring the memories of those lost, there was hope that from this darkness a stronger, more compassionate community would emerge. The tale of the jealous husband who killed his wife and her perceived lovers had come to an end, but its echoes would continue to resonate, a stark reminder of the fragility of trust, the importance of mental health, and the devastating consequences when love turns to obsession. In Pelican Bay and beyond, it would serve as a grim warning and a call to vigilance, ensuring that Evelyn, David, and Jack's deaths would not be in vain.